Without further ado, it is my great pleasure to bring to the stage our first plenary speaker, Mr. Professor Dr. David Beglar. David, as you should have read, is the academic coordinator for the Master of Science in Education and the PhD programs at Temple University, Japan campus. He's published dozens of academic articles in some of the most influential publications in our field. He recently co-authored the 4th edition of an academic listening textbook called Contemporary Topics 3, published by Pearson. His research interests include foreign language assessment, vocabulary acquisition, materials development, and reading fluency development. And he is also instrumental in establishing the what many of us in the field consider the threshold, the amount of reading required to realize gains on measured tests. So when you talk about a threshold, you can't not talk about Mr. David Beglar. So his extensive reading and listening, he's going to speak today about extensive reading and fluency, promises and limitations, and he's going to argue that extensive reading alone is not the most effective way to promote greater fluency. So, Mr. David Beglar, please take the stage. Join us and take it away.
Yeah, this is fine. Should I use this one?
Do you want to have hands-free, or you want?
I might use it.
Okay. Yep.
Before I get started, I'd like to say 2 things. Number 1, I'm suddenly very unhappy with my position in the conference because there is no way I can compete with that amazing performance we just saw. So I'm like, well, why do I have to follow that, you know? So anyway, I do have to follow that. The second thing, speaking to a few people this morning and finding out about all the different places that people have come from to be here today. I think this says something very wonderful about extensive reading, that this thing we call extensive reading has brought people together from many different countries, for a very, very good purpose, right? To help us educate our students and help our students succeed. My personal view of education is that every human being has latent abilities within them, and that our job as teachers is to help our students bring out those latent abilities, those skills that are sleeping, that are dormant within them. And to the extent that we can do that, and to the extent that our students can do that, we're succeeding at education. So education, to put it mildly, is extremely important. Okay, so today, I think in the introduction you already kind of have some idea about what I'm going to talk about. So I'd like to give you a few more specifics. First of all, we'll just start out with a brief definition of reading fluency, and then we'll move to some theories of fluency from the field of cognitive psychology, since we don't have such theories in our field of second language acquisition. Based on the theories from cognitive psychology, we can make a list of desirable characteristics of texts that promote fluency development. And that will lead into a little bit of talk about the strengths of extensive reading, the ways that extensive reading aligns with the theories that we have, and the limitations of extensive reading. Sorry to say, but nothing is perfect, and that includes extensive reading. And then finally, I'll talk about what has been called, this is not my term, but it's a term I like very much, a fluency-first approach to reading instruction. And at the heart of that approach is extensive reading, okay? All right, so let's get started. So fluent readers, they have highly automatized access to semantic meaning and the ability to parse syntax rapidly. I deleted one of my slides that, on hindsight, I shouldn't have deleted. And I talked about, in the previous slide, what are called sublexical processes. And what this means, it's what it sounds like. So if you think below lexis, below vocabulary, what would that be? And it would be the things that make up words. And they come in two forms. So one would be letters on the page, right? So to make the word cat, you need C-A-T. So that would be the orthographic level. And then we have a pronunciation for C-A-T, cat, right? So there's three phonemes, the k, a, t, and that would also be sublexical. And it's very, very important, absolutely necessary, that people automatize the sublexical parts of the language. I remember when I was probably about 7 years old, maybe I was in second grade, third grade of elementary school, some of my classmates were having difficulty reading. And if they would see a word like cat, they would go, ka-at, right? What does that mean? It means they were working at the sublexical level. They were trying to sound out the word based on each individual letter. Okay, so that's the kind of curse of being a beginner when you're trying to read. You can't even get to the lexical level, where you're dealing with words in a holistic way. So once we get to the word level, we do have to be able to access meaning very, very quickly. An example of this, when I was teaching reading, I was also a vocabulary teacher. And this is something that will come up a little bit later. Nothing is more important for reading than lexical knowledge. You must know the words. And to be fluent, you must have rapid access to the words. Well, I'm kind of an old-fashioned guy in some ways, probably because of my age. So my students were using physical word cards, okay? Nothing digital. And what I told my students is, when you look at the word card, you don't know the word until you know it instantly, okay? If you take 1 second to get the meaning of the word, you don't know it in my class, all right? And so they would work with their word cards over and over and over again until they had the words automatized. We call that sight vocabulary, right? Meaning when you look at the word, there's no thinking, there's no hesitation, just instant recognition. The way that we recognize our native language. When you put words together, what do you get in a sentence? And the answer is you get syntax, right? Syntax is word order. So sometimes when I read Japanese, I have problems at this level, meaning I understand every word in the sentence, I think, but I don't understand the sentence, okay? So I'm not able to put the words together in a coherent, meaningful way. So yeah, syntax is important. And that would be the phrasal and kind of idea that we have, say, a noun phrase, a verb phrase, a prepositional phrase. And we need to be able to chunk these phrases together and process them very rapidly and very accurately. Intersentential relationships is what it sounds like. So when we read one sentence, then we read the next sentence, we can't forget the first one, right? We have to keep the first one in mind so that we can understand the relationship between the first one, the second one, the third one, the fourth one, so that when we come to the end of the paragraph, we know what the holistic meaning is of the paragraph. Okay, and then jumping down to the bottom, activation of appropriate schemata. So I think, as you know, reading involves, both the bottom-up processes, that is everything I've been talking about so far, but it also involves what's inside of us. So meaning our knowledge of the world, our knowledge of culture, so that we can interpret what we're reading in some meaningful way. And so that's why different people will have different understandings of the same text, right? It's because none of us have the same knowledge. None of us have the same cultural knowledge. We have different personalities that, some people are kinder, other people are stricter. Some people focus on justice, some people focus on compassion or mercy. And so, based on those factors, we get different interpretations of the same thing. But we're getting those interpretations based on our schemata, right? Based on our top-down, so-called top-down processing. The cognitive processes that are automatized, fast, effortless, without intention. So say, do you see the word intention there? Can you stop yourself from reading it? Can you stop yourself from understanding it? And the answer is no, no. That's what's meant by effortless and what's meant by without intention. And it's unconscious. So right now, speaking my native language, I have no conscious thought about the sound system of English. I have no conscious thought about the vocabulary of English, no conscious thought about the syntax that I'm using, right? It's so highly automatized that it's below the conscious level. And ideally, that's what we want, okay? That's very hard to achieve, right? It takes many, many years to achieve that kind of level, but it's certainly the goal where language is concerned. And I think it also tells us, when we think about how we process our native language, yeah, that's the way language is meant to be processed by human beings. Meaning, language is not meant to be this conscious, laborious, difficult thing which we all experience when we learn a foreign language. Language is meant to function the way that it works in our native language. Meaning it's unconscious, it's highly automatized. And this is why extensive reading is so important in the world of reading, because it's going to be, at least in my opinion, the number one way that we can achieve this kind of rapid, automatized form of reading. Okay, in cognitive psychology, we have some theories here: consistency theory, strength theory, chunking theory, instance theory, and verbal efficiency theory. And we'll just look at each one of these really quickly. Consistency theory says that automaticity develops best through repetition, basically. So the dance performance that we just saw, I'm very, very sure they were using consistency theory, meaning how many times do you think they practiced that dance? Dozens? I doubt it. I would say hundreds. Probably they practiced the same dance hundreds of times in order to be that coordinated, not to forget their parts, things like that. So consistency theory, every time you see a great musical performance, maybe a great athletic performance, part of what we're seeing is consistency theory at work. So it's a very important theory. I think the problem in our field or with extensive reading, at least in my experience using extensive reading, is that it's difficult to get students to read a book a second time. Go back to a book they read 6 weeks ago and read it again. Now, when I was a child, I think I was a little bit traumatized one day, probably more than one day, but one day I remember I asked my mother to read this book to me, which she read to me all the time, but I really annoyed her because I forget what she said exactly, but it was basically, I have read this book to you so many times, right? Why do you want to hear this book again? Well, and I'm sure that many of you, if you're in this room, probably your parents helped you out with literacy skills by reading to you when you were a young child. But the point I'm making is, I think as children, we unconsciously understand the idea of repetition and that we can learn a lot from extreme repetition. Because if my mother skipped a page, sometimes she was tired, and she would try to skip part of the story, I would catch her. I would say, don't do that, right? Come on, tell the story properly. And so I had the book memorized, but I still wanted the repetition. Okay, unfortunately, as adults, we've lost that strategy for the most part. Our students have lost that strategy. So this is a very difficult issue. I don't personally know how to solve it. And so maybe, that's something we can all think about, is how can we motivate our students, get them motivated to appreciate the power of repetition, which would be consistency theory. Strength theory, when you see the word stimulus and response, the first thing that would come to my mind would be old-fashioned 1950s behaviorism. However, there are definitely updated versions of stimulus response ideas. One updated version would be connectionism. Another would be the usage-based approach, say in our field, promoted by people like Nick Ellis. But still, they're dealing with a kind of stimulus response idea. So the idea is the more we process things, and kind of going back to consistency theory, the more we process the same thing, the stronger the representations become in our mind. And I'm sure we've all experienced this. So something I do a little bit, I don't have too much free time, but in my free time, I play the drums. I played the drums since I was a small child. And as a drummer, I totally appreciate the idea of consistency theory and of strengthening particular patterns, particular drumming patterns. And how do I strengthen them? Simple, repetition, repetition. Keep going back until it becomes automatic, till I don't have to think about it, till it becomes fluent and smooth. So how do you strengthen? And the answer, very simple, it's the amount of processing. So extensive reading is going to fit into this theory very, very well, because we have no better way to have our students do large amounts of processing than through extensive reading. Chunking theory came from cognitive psychologist John Anderson, and more technically it's known as ACT theory. Anderson worked at Carnegie Mellon, and where a lot of good cognitive psychologists are at. And basically what Anderson found is that as people did more and more processing, the chunks of information they were able to process became larger and larger and larger. And this was a very, I think in Anderson's point of view, the strongest reason why people were becoming more fluent. So for example, if I say, I came to Hokkaido yesterday. Okay, there's no chunking. It's word pause, word pause, word pause. But if I say something like, I came to Hokkaido yesterday, 3 chunks, right? Or I came to Hokkaido yesterday, 1 chunk. So you can easily see how as we become more fluent, as we become more automatized with something, yeah, the chunks start to increase. Or to put it a different way, the amount of pausing decreases, right? Fewer pauses. And so this is a big part of fluency development. How do you develop this ability to chunk? Again, it's amount of processing. So once again, extensive reading fits into chunking theory very, very nicely. Instance theory, another cognitive psychology theory, is the idea that when we're processing information, we can do it in 2 ways. One is what's called using an algorithm. Okay, algorithm is just a very fancy technical name for a rule, okay? So remember my example a few minutes ago about cat. And I said if you're a very beginner reader, you might process cat as C plus A plus T. Okay, this is a very bad way to process cat. However, you know, you see that once, you see the CAT pattern twice, you see it 10 times, you see it 20 times. And what the research showed, and what your common sense would tell you, is there's going to come a point where you don't see cat as C plus A plus T anymore, right? You abandon the algorithm and you go to what's called an instance in memory. Instance just means I don't see it as C plus A plus T, I just see it as cat, right? And so when you make that shift away from the algorithm to the instance, you're going to become much more fluent, because obviously it's much faster to access cat than C plus A plus T equals cat, right? That's very, very slow way to process. But unfortunately, when we're beginning to learn something, we are stuck with the algorithm. Verbal efficiency theory from one of the great researchers, Charles Perfetti, basically focuses on bottom-up processing, right? You got to get the letters, you got to get the phonology, you have to get the words highly automatized. And why is that? Well, the reason, it's a memory reason. Our working memory, meaning the memory that we're using every waking moment, you know, to process the lights in the room, the sound of my voice, the feeling of the seat that you're sitting on, right? So our mind is processing all this sensory input, but it's limited. We're very, very limited, especially where informational processing is concerned. So basically, we need to get rid of those limitations to the extent possible. And where reading is concerned, it means we have to automatize the orthography, right, the writing system. We have to automatize lexical access so that when we see a word, we can access the meaning instantly, not in 1 second, instantly. And we need to be able to put those words together in syntactic chunks with no effort, with very little cost to our working memory. And when we do that, it opens up our working memory for processing meaning, okay? So again, when we think about our native language and we're reading something or we're listening to something, right? When I read English, I'm not spending any of my precious working memory space thinking, is that a D or is that a B? Which, by the way, I remember doing that when I was in first grade. It's like, is that a B or is that a D? Is that a G or is that a Q? Okay? Or in Japanese, is that a shi or a tsu? You know, if you're looking at katakana, right? And so as children, you know, we have this kind of confusion. And yes, we need to get rid of that confusion if we're going to be fluent. Same thing goes, for instance, for words. You know, if you have two words that are spelled similarly, we have to be able to disambiguate, right? We need to be able to distinguish them, you know, very, very rapidly, because that will slow us down if we can't. Okay, so thinking about the theories we just talked about, you know, consistency theory says read text more than once, read texts that are similar in terms of lexis, syntax, and concepts. One time when I taught extensive reading, I was always kind of experimenting with different ways to do it. And I decided, okay, I'm going to figure out my students' levels approximately. Actually, they're going to figure it out, and I'm going to say, okay, let's go with that level. And I was using, I'm not trying to be a salesperson for Oxford, but at that time I was using Oxford Bookworms books. And I told my students, okay, we have 10 different books at the level at which you're going to read. I wanted to give them some autonomy. So I said, I want you to read 7 of the books at that level, and you can read them in any order that you want. Okay, they were very happy with that system. But, you know, what was I trying to do? Well, I was trying to do texts that are similar in terms of lexis, syntax, maybe not concepts, because the books were about different topics, but the linguistic part, right, the vocabulary recycling, the syntactic patterns recycling, that's what I was aiming for. It seemed to work well. And after they finished the 7 books, they would go to the next level, 7 books, next level, 7 books. Okay. Strength theory, as I said before, the key would be to read large amounts, same with chunking theory, same with instance theory. Verbal efficiency theory, I wanted to throw in the idea of vocabulary, because for Perfetti, vocabulary is key. You have to know the vocabulary, and you have to know it instantly, okay? So again, nothing is more important for reading than lexical knowledge. It's number 1. That's what the research shows, right? Okay, so the strengths of extensive reading is, I think there's a lot of consistency theory happening, like the example I just gave about having my students read 7 books at the same level, you know, say the 400-word level of Oxford Bookworms. There should be a lot of recycling going on, so it's a good example of consistency theory. Strength theory, chunking theory, instance theory, verbal efficiency theory. It may sound strange in a way to put those together, but I don't think it's strange, and here's why. When you read large amounts of text, as we do with extensive reading, there's different outcomes, okay? There's not just one outcome. And those different outcomes are described by the different theories. So when you read a large amount of text, is there strengthening among different parts of the language in your mind? You know, between letter combinations, collocations, right, word combinations, syntactic patterns that fit together, right? Noun phrases always fit together with verb phrases, okay? Or prepositional phrases always have a preposition and a noun phrase combination, right? So I'm not saying the students learn what I just said consciously. We don't even want that, actually. We want them to learn it unconsciously, so that they're just processing these things that I said without thought and without hesitation. Chunking theory, right? So this would be another outcome, a different outcome from strength theory of reading a lot. Instance theory, making that shift from the algorithm to accessing the instance. That's another outcome, a different outcome of reading a lot. And then verbal efficiency theory, where you automatize the orthography, the phonology, the lexis, the syntax of the language. It's a different outcome. So putting these theories together and saying they all operate based on large amounts of processing, based on large amounts of reading. Okay, some limitations of extensive reading. The biggest problem I ever ran into with extensive reading was student motivation. I mean, some people whose names I won't mention in the field say that, oh, everybody's going to love it. They're going to love extensive reading. Well, somebody needed to tell that to some of my students, okay? Yeah, for sure. Some of my students really enjoyed extensive reading. You know, I'm not saying anything different, but some of them didn't, right? Some of them were just very resistant, not just to extensive reading, they were resistant to English, right? It was an English thing, not really an extensive reading thing, I don't think. Okay, so this is a problem. And so that's a whole nother talk, right? Is motivation. How can we motivate more and more of our students? And not just motivate them, but is there, I mean, maybe this is reaching really, really high, but can we actually get the vast majority of our students to enjoy reading? And I think that has become more and more difficult with the advent of what's going on in the internet, where young people are exposed to I don't have a name for it, but it's anything but extensive reading. It's just these short bursts of language that are constantly changing. And if you don't think that's influencing the way that their mind operates, then you need to read about that, because it's not good. It's not good, that fast, constantly changing form of input. So I think now we're fighting, that kind of problem. A lack of task variety. A couple papers I published were not based on task variety. They were actually a pure extensive reading course, okay? That's all the students did when they came to this class. It worked well, okay? However, it was an elective course. Everybody chose to be there. So I think, that makes a difference, right? Not a required course. So I think having a pure, quote unquote, pure extensive reading course is a very good idea if you can get that into the curriculum as an elective, and then let the people who want to partake in that sort of course, come. And I think it'll work great. However, generally speaking, I don't think that's the way I would run a reading course, right? If I were told, David, you have to teach reading, I'm not going to say, oh, okay, the only thing they're going to do is extensive reading. Oh, no way. No way I would say that. Okay, extensive reading does not push learners to read faster than normal. Now, interestingly, every one of the theories from cognitive psychology I showed you, none of them, this is amazing to me, none of them talk about pushing speed. They just basically say the speed will come naturally through lots of processing. Well, remember, I'm a drummer. In the drumming world, we don't believe that. We use metronomes, and we consciously keep turning up the metronome and consciously working on playing faster, okay? I think we need to do that. I think we need to do that because we're trying to get people to sprint, right, as they're reading. That would be fluent reading, 200 words per minute or better type of reading. But can you become a good sprinter by only jogging? And I think extensive reading is jogging, okay? Because there's no pressure on speed. You just go at your comfortable pace, whatever that is. Now, will the pace increase over time? Yeah. It'll increase, okay? But is it the most efficient? Is it the most effective way to get increases in reading rate? I don't think so. And there's evidence that shows it's not the most effective way. So we need to add some things to extensive reading. Okay, so some premises that come out of all this that I've been talking about. Learners must process large amounts of text. Learners must comprehend. I haven't really said much about that, but it's not reading, right? You're not reading if you don't comprehend. So that's a given. You must understand what you're reading, because to boil language down to a really tiny essence, it's connecting form with meaning. So if you don't understand what you're reading, it's impossible to make that connection, right? So when I say form, form would be the CAT, cat. That's the form in the English language, and you need to be able to connect that with the proper meaning. Premise 3, I think the person who has pushed on this idea far more than anybody that learners must read faster than normal some of the time is Paul Nation, okay? To me, he's the guy who said this very, very important idea. And then the last premise, this is a motivational premise, by the way. Learners must read in a variety of ways. Variety, when you read the motivational literature, no surprise, variety is generally speaking a motivator because it keeps the boredom away to some degree. Okay, so what would I add to extensive reading? I would push for speed, as we were just talking about, Paul Nation's kind of idea that he's repeated in various papers, and timed reading. And Nation has done some research on this. When I was teaching reading, at the beginning of every class, actually at the beginning we worked on vocabulary with our cards. And then the second thing we would do would be 2 timed readings every day. And we would chart it out, the way that you normally chart timed reading. We were getting increases, maybe 20, 30 words in an academic semester, 20 or 30 words per minute, I should say. Reading while listening, I didn't actually do this myself, but there are research that shows this is another way to push for speed. So you have the reading text in front of you, and you're hearing someone read the text aloud. It could be the teacher, it could be something recorded. Why is that a push for speed? Well, the answer is presumably the rate at which the text is being read is a little bit faster than what most of the students would read at normally. Skimming and scanning. As a reading teacher, I always did this. These are both fluency activities. You're supposed to skim fast, you're supposed to scan fast. So again, when I was a reading teacher, one class we would do scanning activities, next time skimming, next time scanning, next time skimming. So we were always doing these in an alternate fashion as we went through the semester. The repeated reading, I tried and failed. What I mean is that when I tried, we would read like 10 graded readers, and I would say, okay, everybody, I want you to go back and your favorite book so far, right? I thought that would work. Your favorite book, I want you to go back and read it again. But then when I talked to my students, let's just say they were not enthusiastic about that. So that was a problem I certainly never solved. I gave it a shot. I couldn't get it to work, but I'm not giving up. I think it's very, very beneficial if we can get people to do some double up on the books. Narrow reading, very much consistency theory. And so you read similar texts. Typically the magic number is 3. Could you do this with extensive reading? Again, this might be very tricky to do. But what if you had 3 books about, say, the Beatles, by different publishers, right? And you asked your students to read the 3 different books. Now, there's going to be presumably a lot of overlap because it's the same topic, but they are different books. So that would be an example of narrow reading. Reading aloud, yes, I had my students do this, very intensive. I would make a recording of a paragraph. They would read the paragraph. I would listen to it. Okay, a lot of time on the teacher's part. And I would mark places where their fluency was breaking down because I was interested in rhythm. I said, good rhythm, good rhythm. And we would work on it one-on-one, so a lot of time for the teacher. And they would give me a new recording, and it was always really good. The second recording was always really good. As we went through the semester, the recording quality became higher and higher and higher, meaning more and more fluent, better rhythm, better rhythm. And then the explicit study of, in parentheses, high-frequency words. It depends on the level of the student, what words they need to work on. But I think, as many of you know, the average text is made up of roughly 80% high-frequency words of English, which means the first 2,000 words of English. Our students must know those words, and they must turn them into sight vocabulary as soon as possible. That's why I was using the word cards, as we were trying to automatize the high-frequency words of English. Okay, the advantages of this fluency first approach: large amounts of reading, there's a variety of activities, sometimes learners are pushed to read faster, and there's an emphasis, not spoken so much, but there's an emphasis on automatizing the bottom-up processing. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. Do we have, are we done, or 1 minute, or a couple questions? Okay. I guess there's time for a couple questions if anybody has a question. Yeah, Rob?
Do you distinguish between intentional fluency and incidental fluency?
Intentional meaning you're...
So, for example, a 4-3-2 activity, or I'm going to read this and try and get myself faster by 5% or 10%. So
Yeah. Okay.
The outcome from, say, extensive reading.
Yeah, I would say we want to use both.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, both. So, and oh, by the way, I know many of you are not from Japan, but Japanese students in secondary school, they don't do fluency activities. I mean, I think that would be very rare. And so whenever I did a fluency activity, I think what Rob mentioned as an intentional activity, like timed reading, for example, I gave a little talk, very short, about, why are we doing this? Or when I got them doing extensive reading, why am I asking you to read this book that I think some of them felt insulted, right? It's like, hey, I'm better than this. And it's like, no. No, here's why we're reading this easy book. And once I explained it to them, they were very cooperative because they understood, oh, okay, yeah, there's a good reason for me to do this. So you don't want the students resisting, right, because they don't understand the purpose of the activity. Any other? One more? Do we have time for one more?
One more, yeah.
Last question, okay.
Thank you. Would you tell me the specific reading rate, the number of reading rate for two readings?
The reading?
I understand the Japanese readers usually read with a rate less than 100 words per minute.
Oh, okay. Yeah, when I was teaching at a good private university where I live in Japan, my bad students, first-year university students, the bad ones, I'll call them bad, they were all actually pretty good, but 80 words per minute at the beginning of the first year. And my quote-unquote good students were reading at 120 words per minute. And if you read the literature, the goal would be around 200. So all of them were very, very far from being a fluent reader. So after 6 or more years of education in Japan, they're very far from being fluent readers. And I would say the number one reason for that is they haven't read enough. They needed to be doing extensive reading throughout junior high school and high school. Okay.